Well, welcome to the webinar on intercultural sensitivity. Again, my name is Don McCrabb. We are now recording the webinar, and we just want to pause for a moment to ask the Lord to bless this time together. Good and gracious God, you are the giver of all good things. We ask you to send your Spirit, the Spirit of Jesus, to be with us and reveal to us how to be sisters and brothers to one another. We pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, this is Sister Mary. Mary, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, and I'm going to make you the host.
Okay.
You are going to be in the driver's seat.
I don't even have a license.
As of right now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. And I'm very glad that all of you are here. I wish I could see you, but that's not part of the way this is set up. I'm Mary McGlone. I'm a sister of St. Joseph of Carondelet, currently serving on the congregational leadership team. And I've been working on this question of intercultural sensitivity development for a long time. And what I'm going to present today is the basic theory that comes from the work of Milton Bennett and Mitch Hammer, who have designed the Intercultural Development Inventory, which helps everybody see, helps a person see where she or he is in terms of a developmental scale of intercultural sensitivity. And so with that, I'm going to start sharing the screen and giving you the theory. We're going to go through this. You'll get the theory in a couple of different ways. And so let's see from the beginning. This idea of intercultural development is really an exploration of worldviews. And as I said, it's built on the work of Mitch Hammer and Milton Bennett. I have just finished reading Fratelli Tutti. And I think that a lot of what Pope Francis says touches right into this. And I loved this quote from him: "Life, for all its contradictions, is the art of encounter." And I think what the development of intercultural sensitivity is all about is learning how best to encounter one another. So this model is a developmental model. It assumes that we construct the reality we live in and our worldview based on our experiences and our awareness, as Plato said, or Aristotle, reflection on our experience. We increase our capacity to understand others through reflection on our experience. And as I'm doing this, Don, you have a PDF of these slides that I think you can make available to people, right? You let them know that maybe in the chat. So this developmental model is a measure of our experience and our awareness out of that experience. It's not a measure of behavior or anybody's morality. The more we develop, it leads us toward a more complex understanding of the world we live in. And I think this is very much in line with the kinds of things that Teilhard de Chardin talked about in evolution. Our evolution is always toward a more complex understanding that allows us to build unity in a way that's not possible without it. So it begins with culture. What is a culture? Well, the definition I first had was a shared way of organizing common life, a shared world of meaning, family, food, economic life, friendship, belonging. Now, Fratelli Tutti said that a culture talks about a people's most cherished convictions and way of life, their desires, interests, ultimately the way they live their life. Culture is expressed more subtly than overtly, very often through unspoken agreements. You know, if you've been in various different countries, you may have learned that there are very different ways of dealing with getting in line to get on a bus or an airplane or whatever. It's everybody knows how you do it among us, whoever that us happens to be. The visible elements of a culture, food and clothing and so on, are really less significant than the unspoken ones, which makes cultural diversity a challenge. Now, my culture has taught me the right way to do things. It started with my mother, and every one of us can say that. We were taught this is how you do it. And a culture makes life predictable among us. Our culture allows us to interact with others in an understandable and respectful way. There are things that I would do in it from a US culture that look very disrespectful in Eastern Europe. So this is a model of intercultural sensitivity. It's a stage theory. And basically the three major movements are from ethnocentrism through what they call minimization into ethno-relativism. Ethnocentrism is the most, we might say, black and white. It believes that my culture is central to the reality, or it is the reality. I don't need any education to understand what's going on. I get it right away. It's obvious. What I see is what's there. It doesn't take into account that I see everything from a particular perspective. Ethnocentrism, and we have to realize this, is natural. We start this way from childhood. It's how we've been taught. You know, even our vocabulary teaches us how to focus on the world. Then we can move toward minimization, that I stop thinking of my own as the central, and I recognize that there are other kinds of people, other ways of doing things. And here's where the value change comes. In the beginning, in the defensive stages, my way is the only way and the others are wrong. And here I start to say, well, the differences aren't all that important because underneath, we're all basically the same. It's a little bit, I think if we wanted to put in an analogy of music, in minimization, I recognize the melody line of everything. And I say, that's the melody, but I haven't caught on to how to hear the harmony. In minimization, we encounter others, and when we see differences, we say, well, it's not really all that different. It's an attempt to go beyond what looks like it could be a frightening or a dividing difference into more of a unity among us. Then the third major stage in ethno-relativism, I've begun to understand in a more complex way. And we're going to get through these things in about 3 different ways. So don't think that you've got to have it all in your head right now. But I begin to understand that my experience is relative to a cultural context, sort of like, you know, I insisted when Don was introducing me that I'm from Colorado. If you're standing on a mountain, it depends on where you're standing, what you can see. And sometimes the mountain that you're trying to climb is out of sight because you're on it. So my experience always is relative to a cultural context. It comes from a perspective, and the meaning of what's going on is relative to that context. And the differences among us are really real. Cultural differences. These are real differences. They're different ways of conceiving of things. So as we get to understand this, we do begin to see how colorful our world really is. So why is it important? Well, what do you see in this picture here? Is it a beautiful young woman, or is it a rather old hag? What do we see in a situation? You know, if you keep looking at this picture, you'll see one and the other and one and the other. And it depends on perspective. It depends on focus. What do I see when I see someone else's behavior? I was talking to Don yesterday about this. I said, you know, I was in Ukraine a number of years ago, and there was a younger sister who really wanted to talk, and she had very fine English, which made it possible for us to talk. And she wanted to go out walking, and we went walking in a park. And as we did, she naturally took and held my hand as we walked along. Now, that's not my normal way of walking around with my friends, holding hands with another woman. But it was so natural to her that I just said, well, you know, this is how it's done here. As we look at this, there are 6 stages in this theory of intercultural sensitivity. And they get, there's some complexity in them. So we'll begin with the beginning. I always like to think of, this is sort of the Archie Bunker. And, you know, when we talk about this as a developmental theory, it's very important to remember that as we develop, we have to go by stages. You can't, if somebody is here in an absolute refusal or inability to recognize cultural differences, in absolute denial about the existence of anything else that's valid, we can't expect them to be Mahatma Gandhi tomorrow. I said, you know, you have to learn to crawl before you start to walk. And Don mentioned that you have to learn to turn over and be on your stomach before you can learn to crawl. And what I love about that is that turning over is kind of the same word as metanoia. This is all about ongoing conversion. We note differences, but we don't notice so much the differences, and we avoid them. We don't like to be really near the other. You know, this is I don't know if you've ever been with people traveling in another country. You might be in Paris or you might be in San Salvador, and all of a sudden they say, oh, thank God there's a McDonald's, some real food. You know? Try to stay as close to your own culture as you can. And, you know, most of us realize that some of this is because you're nervous. So the next stage once you begin to recognize that there are other possibilities, the next stage of growth is defense. You've got a strong commitment to your own worldview. This is in defense. One of the linguistic keys, at least in English, is when we refer to the others as them. Those people do it that way. In defense, there's a sense of superiority of your own culture. And I think it's really important to remember that that's natural. You were taught the right way to do things. And so it's automatic that one would say, well, this is the right way to do it. And that also breeds an instinctive mistrust of alternative methodologies. You know, when I was first in Peru, teachers could not believe the way the US sisters handled a classroom. We just did it entirely differently, and we were, of course, wrong in the way we did it because it wasn't part of their culture. You know, people who look at acupuncture and say that can't, that's just folk belief or superstition. Another piece of defense is when you do relate to somebody from a different culture, you translate them right into your own. Well, others may be like that. I don't see you as one of them. An interesting thing that happens, well, here, the little cartoon. This is an old one from the New Yorker. And if you can't see it, the guy with his hat out is saying, it's not as if I'm asking you to acknowledge our common humanity. You don't have to do that in order to give somebody something. In the area of defense, there is this very interesting thing, which I think we may have seen at times in people who have gone to mission, in people who have gone to other cultures. It's the reverse of defense. Instead of seeing the other as wrong, I see my culture as the one that's absolutely wrong. It's still a dichotomy. One is right and one is wrong, but it reverses. You know, some people say it's like going native. In the Spanish here it says it makes the other one holy. Canonizing the other. And I may attempt to be like the other, which is something I can never do. I mean, it's just impossible to jump into another culture and be it. Because I was begun in this one. The next major stage is minimization. And if we could get most of the world to this, we'd be in pretty good shape. And this is where I think when we work with people in church, a lot of times people in mission, we'll find a majority somewhere in the area of minimization. And when we tend to measure ourselves and think, oh, where am I on these stages? Those of us who are of goodwill, and I'm assuming that probably anybody who's bothering to listen to this is a person of goodwill, we tend to think of ourselves, we tend to evaluate ourselves aspirationally. So where I want to be is the stage that I'll probably hear and say, oh yeah, that's where I am. Realize that as we talk about minimization, it's a darned good place for people to be. You seek to avoid stereotypes. You try to treat others as you would like to be treated. You know, that sounds like the golden rule. The interesting thing is, if I treat others the way I want to be treated, I'm treating them like they are, probably, you know, over 60 from the United States and ideally from Colorado. And so they appreciate the mountains and they'll love all of my references to that. Instead of saying, from where they are, where would they like to be treated? You know, one of the examples, as a sister of St. Joseph of Carondelet, we're primarily in 3 nations, the United States, Peru, and Japan. Well, in Peru, when you greet people, it's a great big abrazo and beso, a hug and a kiss. That's not the natural way for our Japanese sisters to greet you. And if I do that, I'm treating them like I might want to be treated or like the Peruvians might want to be treated, but not like they would. So minimization sort of washes over the differences. Yeah, there might be a chord of harmony back there, but mostly we're all singing the same tune. In minimization, those of us who are part of the majority may be unaware of our privilege. And I think that's something that this past year has brought home to a lot of us in new ways, the idea of white privilege. And this is one of my favorite cartoons that I think explains it wonderfully. It's Mutz. And the little cat says, "I love farm animals. I see myself in their eyes, all made of the same stuff. We are one." And the dog goes, "Oh, that's beautiful." And the cat says, "Yep, to me, they're all just big kitties that smell funny." Well, that's minimization. And it's not a bad place to be, except that not everybody wants to be thought of just like you are. Eventually, we'll get to seeing them as they are. And that's what moving into this third ethno-relative stage talks about, acceptance. In acceptance, you acknowledge and recognize cultural differences. You're aware of your own culture and know that it's one among many ways of experiencing the world. You recognize that every culture is complex. And I think if you haven't seen it, there's a YouTube or a TED Talk called "The Danger of a Single Story." And that's well worth watching to get a sense about the complexity of culture and the fact that we can just get one idea about another people and use that as our only interpretive lens. So in acceptance, you begin to seek opportunities to learn about other cultures. And in this one, Pickles tells the story wonderfully. Grandpa is down on the couch with his can of beer on his belly, and he says to the cat who is licking herself, "Can't you find someplace else to take care of your personal hygiene?" And there's the mama up above, and he says, "What are you looking at?" And she says, "I think living with a member of a different species is fascinating." "Really?" "Oh yes," she says. "Sometimes I feel almost like Jane Goodall living among the chimpanzees. Observing the strange and sometimes bizarre behavior of other creatures is very eye-opening, to say the least. It may seem odd or even repulsive to me, but I know it's all part of nature's wonder." "Hey," he says, "you are talking about the cat, right?" We begin to accept and recognize others. Then another stage in this area is adaptation. Cognitive frame shifting, thinking differently. You begin, I think often of this as what happens, it's analogous to what happens as you become bilingual. You realize that there are two different ways to think, two different ways to talk, and those different languages organize the world somewhat differently. Just the simple fact of, in English, we say it's a red car, as if red were the key component. In Spanish, you say it's un carro rojo. And they're kind of noting that the key thing is that it's car. And secondly, it's red. But you appreciate having more than one cultural way of looking at things available to you. And as you can speak a different language and organize your thinking differently to do that, you can take on the other perspective. And you can begin to explain cultural differences to others. That comes out as well in behavior. You can change your way of interacting in response to cultural differences. You can know when it's appropriate to stand up and speak out, and when that would be more offensive than effective. You're aware that global diversity, if we're going to operate in a global world, we've got to be constantly adapting. And if you're a teacher, you may find that you're able to teach from different cultural perspectives. Now, in terms of getting the cultural perspective, I think that these little kids got it down. The little guy shows up in his pajamas to his sister playing with a car. He says, "Where are mommy and daddy? I have to tell them something." She says, "In there watching the news." "What is the news anyway?" "You know," she says. "It's that show where that guy sits there at a desk and talks about stuff that happened." "Oh yeah." "Why do they watch that?" "They just do." And then, with all the authority in the world, she says, "It's a known fact that grown-ups like hearing bad news from a guy wearing a suit." So he runs off, taking off his shirt, shows up in a suit and a tie, and announces to the parents, "I wet the bed again." Now, this is going to be our third round through these stages. And this is, I think, probably the most important. Now that you've heard them a couple of different ways, we're going to look at the strengths and growing edges. And remember, I said that if we're going to grow in cultural sensitivity or help others, this is going by stages. We have to take folks where they are, help them recognize the positive dimension of where they are and the possibility that there's more beyond that. So if you're in denial, what you can say to this person is, you really have a good sense of your own values and you support a community of like-minded people. Now, if you want to grow just a little bit, begin to recognize that there may be cultural differences that are escaping your notice. There might be more to this world than you see. This could be an immense step, and it could be an immensely difficult step to help people make. Although I think perhaps the analogy of learning to roll over, walk, crawl, walk, and then run could be helpful. When we're in defense, that's my culture is the right one. Now I see that there are differences, and that has only convinced me of how right we are. You can say to these folks, you recognize those differences, and you are not refusing to be ignorant about them. Now your growing edge could be to become more tolerant of differences and start to recognize the basic commonalities among people of different cultures. In minimization, and as I said, this is if we could get most of our society to this place, we'd be in very good shape. Minimization recognizes the essential humanity of every person and strives to be tolerant. Now, I said this, I think, at the beginning, but I will, and we'll get a couple more quotes from Francis, but I think Fratelli Tutti really has a lot to offer us in a number of these points. So the growing edge here is to learn more about your own culture and avoid projecting that culture on others' experience. One of the things, after a few years in Peru, if somebody had asked me what I had really learned, I had to admit that I had really learned a lot about what it means to be a US citizen, because I had come up against real differences in ways of thinking. And that made me aware of who we are. You know, before I went, if you had asked me what my nationality was, I probably would have said Irish, because I grew up in this Irish Catholic enclave, and everybody said that, well, they were Irish, and, you know, part of my dad's family was German, and, you know, and another part of town was where the Italians lived. And in Peru, I recognized that I am from the US. There's an Irish Catholic tinge to it, but I am US culture. And that's what formed me and taught me how to see and talk and think and be. So in minimization, we recognize the basic humanity of others and strive to accept that. When we get into acceptance, we're talking about recognizing cultural differences. Democracy is so in our bones that it's very hard to imagine that a monarchy could be a good form of government. But, you know, for some people, it truly is. There are different ways of organizing ourselves. And I can't, my experience doesn't apply to everybody else. And there's something to learn from somebody who's really different from myself. The way we do this is something that Francis said, and I think this really helps us. What's important is to create processes of encounter, processes that build a people that can accept differences. We cannot move in these stages on our own. It has to be in dialogue. It has to be in interaction. I can study all I want, and yes, reading is going to open me to other experiences, but it's the interaction that's going to be essential, that's really going to help me see where my rough edges are. Just like any relationship, we grow in relation to one another, and we somehow, as we adapt to the other and accept the new, we become more truly, more deeply, more broadly ourselves. So Francis says, let us create processes of encounter, processes that build a people that can accept differences. And I loved this. Let us arm our children with the weapons of dialogue. Let us teach kids how to really meet one another. Again, Francis says, dialogue is often confused with something different, the feverish exchange of opinions. Authentic social dialogue involves the ability to respect the other's point of view and to admit that it may include legitimate convictions and concerns. That's that's the encyclical, 200 and 203. So in acceptance, the growing edge here is to learn to shift perspective and understand the world from a different lens while maintaining your own values and commitment. Now we're on very difficult growing ground. I remember in this perspective thing, one day driving along with my mom, who was probably 88 at the time, we passed a billboard about abortion. And my mother said, I simply cannot understand anyone who would ever have an abortion. And I said, Mom, you said that absolutely right. You cannot understand. You've never heard someone speak from that point of view. You may never agree with them, but up to this point, you've got no understanding of it. And she admitted, and I'm not sure she wanted one either. But as we move in acceptance, we begin to learn how to change perspective. How would I see this from another point of view? When we're in that cognitive adaptation, the strength is creativity and flexibility and perspective. And in order to be here, you've gained a deep understanding of at least one other culture. And again, the encyclical says, in a true spirit of dialogue, we grow in our ability to grasp the significance of what others say, even if we cannot accept it as our own conviction. And so that's a complex kind of tension to hold. I can understand it, even if it's not at least now and maybe never, going to be my own conviction. Intellectual adaptation, cognitive adaptation. I was reading the Spanish, excuse me. Learning to behave naturally in more than one cultural context. You know, a very simple thing is how do we greet people? If I'm in Romania, it's a light hug and a kiss on both cheeks. If I'm in Peru, it's another kind of kiss and a much bigger hug. If I'm in Japan, I watch to see what I'm supposed to do. You know, we have to learn how to behave naturally in different cultural contexts. At this stage, the strength is the ability to behave and communicate effectively in different cultures. The real tension here is to deal with issues of identity that might arise with the chameleon effect, what comes from your flexibility. I remember a story about being in Romania. I had been with this group of sisters for about 5 weeks, and I was struggling to get the language. And, you know, I always say the first time I went to their liturgy, I felt like a Baptist at a high mass. I didn't know when to stand, sit, and I obviously didn't know how to make the sign of the cross the correct way. You know, everything, just trying to guess what part of the liturgy they were in. And then one day I saw myself at Grace Before Meals, where they'd sing after the prayer, they'd sing the Gloria in this sweet little high voice that was just like this. And they would bow 3 times and make the sign of the cross 3 times. And as I was in the middle of doing that, I nearly got into a fit of laughter, thinking if my friends could see me now, they would have me home in a straitjacket immediately, because it did not look like who I am. But I was beginning to communicate in that culture and trying to figure out, okay, I can speak this language, I can speak that language, I can bow or I can laugh loud, depending on where I am. So that's a really quick trip through looking at all of this. Let's see, I wanted to go back there. Let's go up here. We can think about where are our growing edges? How do we plan for the future? Where do we want to go? And how might I use this with other people? Now, I mentioned that the majority of us are probably in the minimization place. It's a really good, and it's a nice place to be. There's the assumption of cultural commonality. And the people in here may not see very clearly the real differences in cultures. And there is an automatic good-willed assumption that we have common needs and interests and goals. A good-willed assumption that there's a universality of our beliefs and our practices. As we want to move forward here, we realize this is where we're assuming that all human beings have common needs, interests, and goals. Now there's a very real reality to that in needs for food, water, clothing, etc. Interests, maybe not exactly the same. And goals, our common goals may be there, but expressed differently. Again, thinking of my friends in Romania, the first time I had been there, we were talking to one of the younger sisters who spoke very good English. And we had met, maybe 80% of the sisters we had met all wore a habit. And so I said to this young sister, do you think in the future, more sisters will wear the habit or fewer? Because they had a kind of hard time, some of them, believing that 3 of us from different congregations of St. Joseph were really sisters because we weren't dressed in the habit. And when I asked her about the habit, she looked at me like I had 2 heads. She said, well, of course, everyone will wear a habit. I said, oh, why? She said, it's a sign of freedom. And I thought, whoa, the last thing in the world I would have said. But for them, it was a sign that you could be openly religious. It was a sign of something very different from what it said to me out of my experience. And so we may have common goals, but we may go at them at what looks like very opposed or different, distinct ways. To keep developing, how do we continue to grow? We try to grow in our knowledge of cultures, know more about cultures. Cultivate open-mindedness. Question yourself now and then. You know, one of my friends used to say, of course, I think my opinion is right. If I didn't think it was right, it would not be my opinion. Well, get a little more open-minded. Learn that you really come from a culture that has some limits. You know, we always use that example of the Eskimos or skiers out of my culture, who can tell you all kinds of different ways, different kinds of snow that, you know, maybe if you're from near the Great Lakes, you just know if it's a lot or a little, or that's what matters to you. To keep developing, and Francis is really big on this in the encyclical, listening skills. The ability to perceive others accurately as they are, not as I am. The ability to relate to others in a non-judgmental, interactive posture. When we're in minimization, we translate the unfamiliar into what we recognize. We tend to be very nice in our own cultural terms. And when it comes to power, we often don't recognize that we have power, institutionalized privilege on the part of those who tend to be the majority. We tend to support universal religious moral principles. In emotions, we may overestimate our sensitivity to diversity issues. And from our part, there may be a subtle but very real and very strong pressure to conform. Moving into acceptance, we try to understand that and remind ourselves that all behavior exists within a cultural context and analyze interactions out of that awareness. One of the greatest skills to cultivate is curiosity. And when you're feeling your values challenged, try to get deeper and see if that's really an ethical problem. In acceptance, when we're getting there, we understand things in their cultural context. We tend to continue to seek more knowledge and experience of different cultures. I begin to understand my own experience in cultural terms. And I begin to learn to tolerate ambiguity. We stress mindfulness in cultural encounters. We learn to intentionally take a different perspective, have empathy with another way of doing things. And we actively, just like you try to build up a vocabulary, you try to build up a repertoire of different cultural behaviors applicable. And so Pope Francis invites us to build a society where differences coexist Now remember, he wrote this one talking about his Muslim friend with whom he made that statement a year ago. Where differences coexist, complementing, enriching, and reciprocally illuminating one another, even amid disagreements and reservations. Each of us can learn from others. No one is useless and no one is expendable. So I'm going to stop that there, and I'm going to turn this back over, if I can, to
Thank you. Well, Mary, thank you very much. We have a couple of questions that popped up
Okay.
while you were speaking, and I wanted to address one of them. Megan asked the question about when people grow up in multiple cultural communities. So it's not necessarily that you're going to another country, but in the neighborhood, your church, your school, that there are so many cultures in the same location. Any
Mhm.
comments on the question of growing up in a multicultural environment?
I'm not sure I know what the question is, or is it a commentary that I think today young people, many of them are growing up with a more multicultural experience. But is there more of a question there that I'm not capturing?
Um, well, she said the question itself that Megan gave was, how does this differ for people who grow up slash live in multicultural communities? So that's the way she phrases the question. The way I would read it is, in one sense, being from various different cultures. I mean, there's part of our cultural understanding of ourselves is that we are a mixture of different peoples. You know, the great American story of, you know, we're all immigrants, those kind of things. And so as it's kind of, we may have this image of ourselves as being multicultural, you know, because the Hispanic family lives across the street and the African American family lives next door. We may have this image of ourselves as being multicultural, but in reality, we all drive cars. You know, we're all Americans, right? We're Americans. So I was just, you know, it's that play of, you know, us being Americans with kind of a multicultural subtext to who we are and what we believe.
Well, the U.S. is a unique, I think U.S., Canada, and Australia are similarly unique in that we're immigrant nations with a long history of that. But we've developed in the United States, as U.S. people, we've developed certain a culture. And, you know, as I said, individualism, the individual rights is a big part of that. And, you know, one of the things I learned from an Irish professor of mine, I said something about, he was suggesting that we pick one of the theologians we had talked about and talk about their synthesis. And I asked, well, could we do our own synthesis? And he said, you US people, you always think that it starts with you. I walk down the street and the buildings I see are 500 and 1,000 years old. And if you've got something that's 25 years old, you think it's time to tear it down and build a new one. You know, and we're part of that culture.
Right. We are part
And
of that culture.
that has, our immigrant roots have affected us and created us in a unique way that's not true in Europe, even in Latin America. Yes, we've got the opportunities to be very multicultural, but it depends on how interactive we are. Have we learned to speak one another's cultural languages and recognize that mine is different? And that doesn't make it better or worse, but richer for knowing yours. I don't know if that responds to the question or not.
I mean, that's really good. Rayfield raises the question of how we could apply some of these insights to the present polarization that is happening in the U.S. today, and within the Catholic Church today. And just that notion of there's this, I was thinking of it more in terms, not denial, but more in terms of defense, that I have to defend my culture. And so now people are talking, using language of like Western civilization and white culture to say, you know, I have to defend my values against someone who doesn't share those values. And so the other becomes hostile, the other's dangerous even. And so, you know, how do we take some of these insights and apply it to kind of our current polarization?
Well, I think one key that for me, I learned from this whole theory is that I have to recognize where you are and not expect you to jump 3 stages at once. And, you know, in there, each of those, and as I said, I think, Don, you'll be able to send out the outline of these slides. Recognize the strength. And really, you know, if I am not in that defensive posture, but the person I'm talking to is, let me really consider what it means to be in that defense. What is that person guarding? And how can I help them appreciate that and appreciate the fact that there can be a step beyond that, openness to something different, you know? And I think this would require a lot of dialogue. It's a lot probably like developing the practice of nonviolence. You have to continually think about it and continually try to create creative responses to a situation that automatically would say fight or flight. And I think anytime that I'm dealing with somebody who is in a different stage than I am, and, you know, putting it in the opposition, it's so easy to get into fight or flight, but how to look for the creative option in there and to say, can I recognize the value of what this other person is valuing? Because only if I can do that, have I created any space for us to stand where we can stand together? You know, and so I would think that, you know, some of the techniques of nonviolence can be very helpful here too.
Excellent, thank you. Another reflection, Father Jim Brotes mentioned, you know, the kind of the challenges of planning and celebrating Holy Week services with a congregation of, on the one hand, Mexican immigrants, recent and first generation, and African American Catholics.
African American.
African American.
Or African immigrants.
No, African American Catholics in an inner city parish in Chicago. So, so you have
a diverse liturgy committee.
you have Chicago, then you have the African American experience, and then you have the Mexican immigrant experience. So,
better start planning now.
Still planning now. I do think it just, I was wondering if you could kind of comment on this in the sense of part of it is trying to get to know each other. Well, how do we begin to identify just common things? I use a lot the opening line, you know, the hopes and dreams, the griefs and anxieties of humans of this age is the hopes and dreams, griefs and anxieties of God, of the church. And so
I think that would be a wonderful thing to use with a group and to sit down and say, you know, first of all, get into your, you know, if we've got this parish, let us say, with Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans, African Americans, and let's say, you know, it used to be a Polish parish, so there's this whole group of the old Polish Guard, which I've seen in Chicago. first of all, start in your ethnic groups and say, what are the joys, the hopes, the anxieties that you identify when you say the church is talking, that the church is identifying with this? What are they to you? And then have those three groups share with one another and start to talk about, well, what do we see differently and what do we see the same?
Right. That's right. Yeah, that's really
You know,
good.
Francis just keeps talking and talking about dialogue. You
Mhm.
know, his encyclical is to say we can't be the same after this pandemic as we were before it. And so where are we to grow? What is it that we're trying to accomplish here?
Um, Sister Mary Paul asks the question, uh, is the creation of these stages that we've just articulated an expression of a culture?
Mhm.
So her question is she identifies a problem, who creates the stages? And if I was from a different culture, would I think of even sensitivity to other cultures in a different way?
I think she needs to answer that question because she's coming from a Nigerian culture and she's got a lot of educational background.
Mm,
I don't know how to get her on the stage,
yeah, I don't know.
but really, I I am I'm a historical theologian by background, and I speak a couple of languages and I've had some experience in various cultures. I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a psychologist, and I have a lot of those same questions. Um, Although the people who put this together as sociologists, as psychologists, claim that it has multicultural value. And they've worked it in multiple, probably nearly all over the world, certainly in the major cultural groups of the world.
Brother Tim Caldwell from the Christian Brothers asks, are there resources from either the Gospels or the writings of St. Paul that you have found helpful in developing the cultural strengths that you've talked about?
Well, the first thing I think of is 1 Corinthians 12, the body. And really, another one is Philippians.
Mm,
Did not cling to godliness, but became one of us. And that's that dispossessing myself, that willingness to let go is probably, it's the Christian challenge uh, for for in which Jesus is our primary example. But that would really be an interesting scripture study meditation to talk about Philippians and that hymn and say, what does that say to us as people in multicultural situations, as people on mission in multicultural mission? How could we look at Jesus as the example of the one who did not cling to godliness, but became one of us in order to lead us where we could go?
right, right. One of the things that I wrestle with, Mary, I'd be interested in your thoughts, and we'll kind of end with this. There's no more questions or comments in here, but sometimes we get this talk about mutuality, that mission has to be mutual. And I understand where that's coming from. And it's kind of a reaction to, okay, we're going to come in and we're going to do
We
this
got to do
for
things.
you, kind of a helicopter approach to mission. And so I certainly get that. On the other hand, a part of this acceptance and moving into adaptability, there is a certain kenosis that's happening. There's a certain self-emptying.
Mhm.
I'm leaving my cultural context and I'm willing to live and work and operate within a different cultural context without surrender, without doing the reversal that you talked about earlier.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, how do you see that? I mean, is mission a being with and being for, that does ask of us a certain kind of self-emptying, which itself, of course, is enriching. Makes sense?
Oh, I think you sort of answered your question as you said it, but the thought that came to me is, the invitation is always to fall in love. And the more we love the other, the more we recognize who they are, the more distinctly ourselves we become. And the more we become something new. And the whole point, I keep going back to the Teilhard idea, is we're all moving into a unity that specializes in our diversity.
Right.
The more we truly love another, the more uniquely ourselves we become. And so I think that's the goal of the body of Christ.
We did have another question that came in. John asked the question, that, I mean, he makes a comment. He really likes the way you've integrated the Pope's new encyclical, and with this presentation. They ask, have you taken the IDI training? Are you
Yes.
familiar with the ICS, which the SVD has used as the basis for developing through the IDI stages?
And I don't know what the ICS is. I am a qualified administrator of the Intercultural Development Inventory.
Okay, great. So John, if you could kind of clarify that in the chat room, what the ICS is. I believe the SVD is the divine words, so that'd be helpful. But if you could clarify that, that would be great. And that kind of so Rachel Thomas Morgan from the University of Notre Dame. She remembers you fondly from being on the board together.
Indeed. Hello.
And she's grateful for the opportunity and personal time of reflection for us. So a number of people have thanked you.
Well, thank you
for the presentation. I think I've got one more. Oh, yes. So Sister Mary Paul has reminded us that, of course, love is the key.
Sure.
I'm going to bring this to a close. To do that, I just want to first, again, thank you, Mary, for a very rich presentation.
Thank you.
Also want to
do it.
Yeah, I want to really thank our participants.
Yes.
We had at the high point, we had 45 people online. And of course, many people registered because they want to receive the recording of this, which of course we will provide. We do want to invite our panel of our viewers, our participants, to consider other needs that they have, especially along the line of interculturality. Is there other resources that people know about that they would like to explore? Clearly, the pastoral, the letter that Pope Francis has just written, very interested in that. Would it be good for us to pull together a conversation just on that topic, even a study group?
Even parts of it.
Yeah. I understand. I have not read it yet, so you're a few days ahead of me. It was officially released on October 4th, so it's it's only 3 days old. Yeah, and I understand it's the longest of all of the encyclicals written. So I'm sure certainly a lot of
75 pages before the notes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, with that, I'm going to bring this to a close. When I end this conversation, everything goes off, so it may feel very